Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jonathan Fiedler, and I'm the operations manager here at BISG. We have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Laura Brady today for our final in our series of webinars on creating EPUBs. Today, we're going to talk about design meets function, hanging indents, poetry, and other layouts. And Laura, I think, has done a lot of work with poetry in EPUBs in the past, and we are really happy that she'll join us. So we'll hand off to Laura. If anyone has questions along the way, please put them in the Q&A tab. That is easier to follow than in the chats. And we're happy you're all here. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Coffee Break Wednesday. A bit of a late start, but we'll try to get through it all so you can get back to work or not. You choose. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about poetry and complex layouts today. How exciting that the digital publishing world has evolved to the point where we are at last having conversations about design and poetry and accessible layouts. This isn't the first conversation of this sort, of course, but it is most definitely a sign of maturity in the ebook world. And it points to the inevitable question: how do you design for a format that will be read 20 different ways by 20 different readers? Well, you could follow each ebook home offering advice on font choices and page width, but that might be a little bit creepy. The affordance of ebooks is that they are malleable to the reader's needs. The reader can change the font size, the background color, the typeface, the leading and justification. It's a designer's nightmare, really. About 4 years ago, I started working at an indie trade publisher who put out about 4 to 5 poetry books a year. They weren't making EPUB at all at the time, but rather just selling PDFs from their own website. I convinced them that poetry should be more available to a wide variety of readers and to stop using that PDF swear word. And so they started and continue to publish poetry in the EPUB format and even in the odd Braille edition. So, understanding that, I'm just gonna, there, okay. So understanding that we can't control a lot of things about the end user's reading experience, let's talk about how to set that reading experience up for maximum success. Step 1, avoid the fixed layout format, choosing reflowable EPUB wherever possible. So the slide on the screen is a fairly common meme that involves Drake, the Canadian rapper. It's some screenshots from the Hotline Bling video, him wearing an orange puffy vest. And the top image is him saying no, no, no to fixed layout in PDF. And the bottom image is him saying, ah, yes, to reflowable EPUB. I see publishers opting for the fixed layout format because they feel that the page will get too messed up in reflowable. It's too complex. Their artistic vision will be lost. The text design will suffer. I would like to suggest that trying to control a reader's experience like that will come to no good in the end. And opting for fixed layout effectively excludes print-disabled readers from consuming that book. Particularly in the case of poetry, choosing to publish in a PDF or fixed layout format shuts down access to that book for a wide swath of the reading public. Poetry should be easy to access, formatted in a device-agnostic manner, and openly available to whomever would like to borrow or purchase the book. Please be mindful of the impact of your format choices. And let the HTML and CSS do the heavy lifting for you. Format your headers as headers, your text as text. When you need to achieve special spacing, build that with HTML and CSS. Anyone who has worked in a production or editorial department has seen some version of the screenshot on the slide. So the slide is right now showing a snapshot of a Word file where the spacing has been achieved with tabs. It's full of empty returns and multiple word spaces instead of using style sheets and, well, actual formatting. The way that some poetry books are made are the HTML version of this muck. So to that end, use headers for headers, section tags around a poem, and be mindful of your P tags. Use semantic HTML. That may seem like an elementary message, but I see an awful lot of P class equals H1 in the wild. Avoid line break BR tags for turnovers where you can, because that means you have no control, because you have no control over the width of screens and you don't know where that BR tag is going to end up and how it's going to break a line. And use responsive CSS definitions. And so what do I mean by responsive CSS? I mean, use sizing and indents in M's or percentages. I prefer to use M's. So a hanging indent would be a margin left of say 1.5 M and a text indent of minus 1.5 M. And so using M's means that CSS definition is elastic and can expand and contract with the size of the screen. Okay, so what does that mean exactly? So this slide is a picture of a page in Adobe Digital Editions of one not very complex poem, side by side with an image of the print page. It's designed, the ebook version is designed to look exactly like the typeset page. So replicating fonts, etc., and spacing and all that stuff. One of the things I had to figure out when I converted this ebook was whether those turnovers on the second line, whether those are turnovers on the second line or an indented line. And this points to one of the gnarliest parts of digital poetry. It is important in converting poetry to consult a managing editor about how deliberate line endings are and which can be sacrificed to a responsive page. In this case, they looked like turnovers, but the narrow line length on the print page means that I maintained them as an indented standalone line. So each line is in its own paragraph tag with CSS acting to make it spaced as necessary. So you might notice that the line spacing is off on line 7, the line that starts R dragged in, M dash, stars, gas clouds, the dining. I tried to approximate the indent with non-breaking spaces on that line. And you can see that it wasn't totally successful. It's not aligned with the other indented lines. And this is a sort of relatively common approach in poetry markup. But let's listen to this poem and with voiceover. I recorded a short video of what this poem sounds like in Thorium. Thorium is a standalone desktop e-reading app from EDR Labs. And if you weren't aware of this tool before now, I urge you to look into it, particularly as a testing tool. So I'm going to play and cross my fingers that the tech gods are on my side and that the audio will work.
Brightening event. A black hole near the Milky Way is waking up. Scientists have no idea what this means. Sparkling light shows captured by telescopes say nothingness has swallowed the known. At the event horizon, falling materials are dragged in, stars, gas clouds, the dining room set that belonged to my grandmother, a shining gold sweater I left in a drawer of a house I no longer live in. The black hole brightens as it consumes all in its path. We don't know where we are indeed.
So a couple of things I just want to point out. When I tested this book in Thorium and turned on the voiceover to listen to how it was reading, the things I was listening for were appropriate pauses at the end of the lines and in between stanzas. I don't know if you noticed, but so sorry, I lost my spot. So this line here, the known at the event falling materials, those are the non-breaking spaces before are dragged in, and that was underlined, which we can see in the next screen there. So that got underlined as though those non-breaking spaces were a word. So that line that was coded with non-breaking spaces to approximate the indent, those spaces get underlined as if they're a word. And that looks like an error to me, and it sounds like an error to someone who's listening to it and not seeing it. And the stanza that began room set is coded with a BR tag and no word space at the end of the line, so that the end of the line that ends a shining and the next one that starts gold sweater is read as though those two words are one word, so shining gold. So in case it slipped by you, this is a screenshot of those non-breaking spaces being underlined as if they are a word. The main message here is to test a lot. Understanding that a synthetic voice is never going to be as warm and performative as a live poetry reading. Testing with VoiceOver is still mighty valuable. Markup shortcuts may go haywire on assistive technologies in a way that you wouldn't expect. Thorium is one way to do this, but there's a whole range of ways to QA for functionality and accessibility. Okay, so the next slide is a cartoon of two monks in a scriptorium, and one is drawing in a picture while the other one looks on. And the one looking on says, "Whoa, easy on the details, brother. This may be shrunk down for an ebook someday." So whose job is it to make sure that poetry conversions are true to themselves? As with most things in the digital publishing world, this is firmly in the realm of editorial production collaboration. After many years of working in this space, I'm convinced that the key to making more accessible digital publishing landscape is to get editorial staff invested in accessible outcomes. I would never go so far as to suggest that the poets rein themselves in, although poets, please be aware of the needs of both print and digital, I beg you. But editorial guidance when the ebook is converted is, in my humble opinion, key to moving the needle on accessibility and clean digital output. Having access to editorial staff to answer questions as you're converting poetry is critical. I would be remiss if I didn't point to this slightly unconventional approach to digital poetry. One publisher puts this note to the reader at the beginning of all of their poetry ebooks. And I'm going to read this for the benefit of those who can't see the slide. Note to the reader. We encourage you to calibrate your settings by using the line of characters below, which optimizes the line length and character size. And then there's a line of Latin. Please take time to adjust the size of the text on your viewer so that the line of characters above appears on one line if possible. When this text appears on one line on your device, the resulting settings will most accurately reproduce the layout of the text on the page and the line length intended by the author. Viewing the title at a higher than optimal text size or on a device too small to accommodate the lines in the text will cause the reading experience to be altered considerably. Single lines of some poems will be displayed as multiple lines of text. If this occurs, the turn of the line will be marked with a shallow indent. So I really appreciate how this note points out the complexity of balancing the needs of the content and the needs of the author and the format. It's hard. So use semantic HTML, test, and be conscious of the reading experience. I have some resources here, and I would also just like to point out that I'll make my script and my slides available to Brian to distribute to people as he sees fit. My email address is there and my Twitter handle. Please feel free to contact me if you think I can be helpful in any way. I'm more than happy to help. And then a couple things to point out in these resources. The first one is the DAISY knowledge base, which is an essential tool if you're working in EPUBs and digital technology. The second link is to a print disabled reading demonstration that was recorded by someone who is blind. And then 3 articles, 2 articles and 1 video about digital poetry and the complexities and vicissitudes of those kinds of conversions. So are there any questions?
Thank you, Laura. This is Brian, and I apologize for leaving you guys hanging. We had a power failure here, so it's been an interesting 45 minutes. There are a couple of questions that I wanted to start with. One was from Juliet asking if you could repeat and spell the name of the reading tool.
Yeah, it's thorium, Thorium.
Great. And the question that follow up on that is it available for free, or is this something that you can purchase?
It's freeware. You can download it from the website.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Karen's just asking, notes that she's curious what you might recommend for charts and graphs that are too small to read as images, but too complex to be easily reformatted as reflowable text.
Yeah, so this is a really good question. And I was actually going to include an example of a shaped poem and how hard that is to do in digital. And I have been known to put an image of really complex content into an ebook. I really hesitate to recommend this because it's terrible practice in so many ways. So So when you really can't avoid it, so I had a poem that was shaped like a leaf and it had sort of spiky edges on it, and there was no way to do that well in digital. So I put it in as an image and put in really full alt text. So a really full image description that talked about the shape of it and then included all of the text. It was a link out to a long description, so that it was fully there for people who couldn't see it and consume it in traditional ways. But I really hesitate to recommend that. That is really truly a very last case scenario.
While you were giving that answer, Richard Orm also has just put in the direct link to the EDR lab.
Thank you, Richard.
Home for a thorium reader. John, one of the other questions that were asked is, do you have recommendations for inserting spaces in the middle of lines? Particularly when a poet, for example, wants a word on, say, line 3 to align exactly with a different word, either above or below.
Yep, I sure do. This is really complex, actually, and hard to get exactly right. So I would suggest that you do a lot of testing once you have it laid out like you want it to look. So non-breaking spaces are a way to achieve gaps in the middle of a line. The space when it's being read is not going to be as long as I think the poet would intend it. But I have been known to use a string of non-breaking spaces and then one plain word space, so that that string is there and it gets read as essentially two spaces. There's a pause, and that works. But then aligning with the line below, aligning with where the line above ends. The best way to do that is to achieve it with CSS. So with a margin left, that gets it to where it's going to go. I saw an ebook recently where they put the line above in the line below and made it white so that it was spaced exactly right, but wasn't visible to a sighted reader. But of course, it was being read twice to a non-sighted reader and was extremely problematic. Don't do that. So the best way to do it is to use CSS to get that margin left, and then test to make sure it's being read as you expect.
Fabian was asking if you might give more examples about using responsive CSS definitions.
Yeah, so for hanging indents and indents in general, definitely use M's to space those things along. I converted a book recently that had 9 different levels of indents. And so I had, everything from 1M up to, I think, about 15M in terms of spacing things. And because it was defined in M's, it could be as wide as a computer screen and as narrow as a phone, and the spacing would approximate. And again, test on lots of different screen sizes to make sure it's working as expected. When spacing above and below, always use CSS, never put in an empty P tag with, say, a non-breaking space inside of it, because space above and below will mean that the page turns are accurate and they're not inserting extra space where you don't want it. And then in headers, also, using margin top and margin bottom and using M definitions for the font size is a good best practice. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks. Well, they can always follow up with a question if we have a couple more minutes left. I wanted to ask you, just from my own perspective, because we have both a strong interest in accessibility, but also in EPUB, but also a workflow committee. What kind of steps do you often recommend clients take to try and get editorial staff invested in the outcomes that would result in high quality ebooks? I mean, are there tried and true practices that kind of get publishers on the right path?
Yeah, such a good question, Brian. This is a big question. One of the things I think is that editorial staff in general need to be using Word in a fuller manner. So using character styles and paragraph styles from Word, and marking language shifts, for example, with a unique character style, using 2 different kinds of italics for both italics and for emphasis, right from the sort of manuscript stage when they're getting content ready for the production department. This is is critical, in my opinion, to getting the editorial staff involved. And so I have done work with editorial staff to get them using Word more in a more full manner, but also showing them how to make a Word template that has just the styles they need to use and nothing more and nothing less. And then showing them what happens when you bring a really sloppy Word file into layout software like InDesign. So a Word file that is full of empty returns and word spaces, etc., and how it just goes haywire in InDesign, and how any life past the print version, i.e. digital, is going to be extremely problematic.
I mentioned too that as the proof is also in the pudding, that as an editorial or publisher takes on a more integrated approach, the amount of rework that's required at the end should go down.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's a bit of a reward.
And if you're sending your books out to be converted to a conversion house, using a really good workflow with tight Word practices means that that end product is going to be a little bit cheaper too.
Yeah, Richard, after posting the link to the EDR Labs resource, I was just asking the question, or observing that some poetry titles have line numbers in the print book. And his question is, do you have any thoughts on how to deliver those kind of line numbers for a digital edition?
Really good question. I've actually never come across this. And my quick answer is to suggest that you not use lists, because lists will get read in an accessible technology context as a list item. So every line would get read as a list item, and you might want to avoid that. So it might make sense to actually physically insert the line numbers in the text when it's converted to digital poetry. But I'm more than happy to be corrected on that if someone knows a better method to do that.
No, it's always one of the good things about our webinars is that they usually break new ground somewhere.
Yeah, there you go.
So if folks on this call want to suggest an alternative approach or describe something that they've done, we'll be glad to share that as well. Again, I apologize for joining a little bit late, but did you have a chance to talk a bit about what Brady typesetting does and the work that you've been doing?
No, but I'm happy to. So I operate a company called Brady Typesetting. I'm located in Toronto, in Ontario, Canada, and I do ebook conversions and workflow consulting, backlist remediation projects, and I focus, as you may have figured out through the course of this coffee break, on accessibility quite a bit.
Heidi's just making the observation, kind of following up on the poetry and line number question, that said that she'd done one conversion with line numbers, and the only way that she found to do it was to create a table with no lines.
Interesting.
So
that definitely would achieve it.
You're going to go home now, and well, you are home, but sorry.
I'm gonna try things. Yeah.
Yeah, just start trying things at all.
Yeah.
Do you find that there's still, and when you were talking a little bit about trying to find a way to make effective use of synthetic voices, and the importance of testing in that environment, are ebooks still at that phase where some of the functionality or features, there may be best practices, but you still have to kind of do it and then make sure that it actually delivers the result that you expect? Or is it pretty well developed?
Well, I would say it's mostly fairly well developed, but I would say that poetry is kind of the last frontier in that regard. I actually was testing recently and figured out that the way I had been converting poetry for a very long time, with BR tags at the end of lines and no word spaces, was going pear-shaped in an assistive technology setting. So that's why, and that was me letting my foot off the gas and not testing as much as I should have been, and not listening to my own advice. And that's why it's important. Things change. So keep testing, and keep testing in lots of different environments. Thorium is one, but there are a lot of different ways to test for accessibility. And so testing like that did change my approach to how I coded poetry.
And how did you get involved in this work overall? I mean, is this something that you started out with a production or an editorial production background and evolved as the technology became available, or is this something that interested you from early time in your career?
Um, I sort of got slotted as a bit of a poetry expert at the last publisher I was working at. And believe me when I tell you, it wasn't a title I wanted, because poetry is complex and sticky and prickly. But it was also a challenge, and so was really interesting. More interesting to convert than, say, a novel that doesn't have, it's just really straight text. So in a way, it was about taking on the challenge of some different kinds of content that still needed to be as agile and flexible as a straight up novel. And I think poetry gets ignored because, poetry sales are not the same as frontlist novel sales, for example. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't give it the same kind of attention as the hit novel. There's still people who are going to want to read it. And I'm a big advocate of making everything available as broadly as possible and as inclusively as possible.
Sure, and it's, if anything, we all know that the future of publishing is not going to necessarily be more print, but more digital, and
Yeah.
the ability to support it obviously is really important. Before I let you go, we just had one other question. Jennifer was asking, when it came to long descriptions, would you suggest using ARIA described by or ARIA details?
I actually suggest that you use a link out to a nonlinear HTML file where the long description lives. That's, I'm happy to be corrected on this, but I believe that's the best way to do it, that's supported across the device spectrum. So basically you put the long description in a standalone HTML file. So that's a technology if you're making ebooks that you're familiar with, and you link out to it from the image. And then you link back to that spot in the HTML file where the image is. And in the spine, you mark it as linear equals no. So that long description won't show up in the linear flow of the book, but will be there and available for people who need access to it.
And the follow-up on that, and I think you've already touched on it, is should these ARIA roles be included in the figure tag?
They definitely can be. And so I would definitely use ARIA roles inside of the figure tag to point to where the long description is. But if you're using a long description that's a link out to a standalone HTML file, using ARIA is a bit of overkill in that situation.
Great.
So not totally necessary.
Before I let you go, anything that you want to leave the people who've gathered with us today with as a core message, something that you want to make sure that everybody remembers as a result of the presentation you've given today?
Yeah, I have two things: test, 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 and get your editors to help with accessibility and content workflows.
Thank you very much for both for preparing and delivering this presentation today, and for dealing with the technical issues on my end.
No
I really
problem,
appreciate
Brian.
it. And we look forward to hearing more from you going forward. If you would, we will share this presentation. When you get it to us, we'll include it in a follow-up email that we send to everybody who's registered.
Great.
And you're getting, as you probably can see in the comments, just a lot of questions about and comments just saying thank you for the work you've done today.
Ah, you're quite welcome. Thank you for having me.
All right, take care.